But anyhow, most of us already know this, but we have many new residents, so hence this formal introduction. Tonight it's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Todd DePastino, an award-winning historian, author, educator, and one of the country's leading advocates for preserving the stories of America's veterans. A Pittsburgh native, Dr. DePastino earned his PhD in American history from Yale University and has taught history at Penn State Beaver and Waynesburg University, where he received the Lucas Hathaway Award for Teaching Excellence. That's no surprise. He is author of editor of 7 books, including the acclaimed Bill Malden, A Life Up Front, the biography of the famous World War II cartoonist whose work captured the lives of ordinary American soldiers. If you remember, I had that book downstairs in our display cases. In 2008, Dr. DePastino helped found the Veterans Breakfast Club, a nonprofit organization based in Pittsburgh area with a simple but powerful mission to bring veterans together to share their stories and to preserve those memories for future generations. What began as a breakfast for about 30 World War II veterans has grown into a national, international really, organization that hosts hundreds of in-person and online storytelling programs, welcoming veterans from every branch of service from every era, from World War II to today's military. Dr. DePastino often says that every veteran has a story. His work reminds us that history isn't found only in textbooks. It lives in the memories of ordinary people whose experiences have shaped our nation. By listening to these stories, we gain understanding, preserve important history, and build connections across generations. Although he's not a veteran himself, he always tells us that, Dr. DePastino has devoted much of his career to ensuring that veterans know their service is valued, not only by saying thank you, but by taking the time to listen. Through the Veterans Breakfast Club, thousands of personal stories have been shared, recorded, and preserved for future generations. Todd is the editor of that great publication. We are especially pleased to welcome him to Masonic Village because our own community includes many veterans, military families, and residents whose life experiences are part of America's story. His message is one that speaks to all of us. Every life matters, every memory has value, and every story deserves to be heard. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm Masonic Village welcome to Dr. DePastino, America's greatest storyteller. Woo-hoo!
Thank you so much, man. And thank you for also pitching the Veterans Breakfast Club, which is my baby. And it's been around since 2008. This is our quarterly magazine. We send this out to about 20,000 households and hand distribute many more. So please do, if you know somebody who might want to read a BBC magazine which contains a lot of veteran stories, please do pass it along or let me know, and we'll make sure we get one in the mail to you. Also on page 4 of the magazine is our upcoming in-person breakfast schedule, and you'd all be welcome to attend. We love to have non-veterans like me who are there kind of listening to the stories, asking questions, and just participating in the great conviviality and I guess you would say fellowship of these events. So the closest one to here is at Christ Church Grove Farm, up the road off Mount Nebo Road on Duff Road. So, and that's I think on August 19th. So we'd love to have you if you could join us. But I'm here to continuing talk about the history of the Vietnam War. And as you know, we've been doing a deep dive in the Vietnam War by going way back into the history of Vietnam. Part 1 focused on the ancient history, especially that formative 1,000 years when Vietnam was under Chinese occupation, and which generated about a 900-year resistance movement that was finally successful in the year 938 AD. So Vietnam has an ancient history that absolutely forms so much of its identity today. Then last month we turned and focused on French colonization of Vietnam, which began in the 19th century, what the French were after there, and how hard they worked to try and subdue the population, which was almost entirely made up of peasants. We focused especially on what the peasant world is and how profoundly different a peasant world is from, say, a modern 20th century industrial American world. Whole different culture, whole different set of values, and a whole different people that if you don't understand, you're never going to be able to pacify. And so we kind of took a very close look at that peasant world and how it suffered greatly under French occupation. So tonight, I thought we'd turn our attention to the inevitable resistance movement, the inevitable uprising against French occupation that would happen, and that would eventually be led by this man, Ho Chi Minh, who would become the founding president of an independent Vietnam after many, many years. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, but he was first and foremost, I would say, and most historians would say, was a nationalist. That is, he had the goal of the independence of Vietnam from the French as his primary goal, and communism was a way to achieve it and a way to run the country after it was achieved. But primarily, I would say, and I know there are definitely historians who disagree with me, but I would say Ho Chi Minh was nationalist, and I think his nationalism, or the primacy of his nationalism, is what determines Ho Chi Minh's reputation today, which in Vietnam is stellar. A lot of Vietnamese people, lots of Vietnamese people, hate the Vietnamese Communist Party. It's a one-party state and it's an authoritarian state. Ho Chi Minh was the founder of that party and the founder of that state. And yet Ho Chi Minh somehow still enjoys great prestige and admiration and affection of the Vietnamese people. He's seen as somebody, and I think rightly so, as somebody who rises above the petty partisan politics of the Communist Party of the 20th century, somebody who represents more Vietnamese nationhood, somebody who stands almost as a George Washington, you know, the modern founder of modern Vietnam. And so just across the country as you go to Vietnam, you encounter people who criticize the government, you know, criticize the communist state, and yet very much admire and have great affection for Uncle Ho, as he is called, the founding father of modern Vietnam. As I've mentioned to you before, I've done 3 trips to Vietnam with veterans, and I learned as much there on those trips as I ever did in all my studies that prepared me for teaching the history of Vietnam. And one thing that I knew about, but was still quite surprising when you encountered it, was how profound the peasant culture still, how profound of an impact the peasant culture still has in Vietnam. Vietnamese culture is still at root a kind of a peasant culture. You see echoes or you see vestiges of this peasant society everywhere in Vietnam, and you especially see it, and this is how I thought I would open tonight, just because I think it's such a fascinating little quirk of Vietnamese culture. You especially see it in the 3 questions that Vietnamese people ask you when you meet them. And in the south of Vietnam, Vietnamese people tend to be pretty gregarious, pretty outgoing. They like to speak English, they like to meet Americans. And when you do, it doesn't take long for them to ask you 3 questions. And the questions seem very odd to us, but they're commonplace in Vietnam. And the first question is, how old are you? It's really strange to meet somebody on a train and to talk to them for 5 minutes, and they say, how old are you? You know? And the reason why they ask that is because Vietnamese culture worships age, reveres the elderly, you know? Colonel McClinchy, you'd be a god in Vietnam. The older you are, the more respect you get, the more respect you receive. And it's not just a matter of respect or status, it's real the more power you have. I was recently, a couple months ago, at a Vietnamese funeral, a Buddhist funeral, and it was funny. I walked in, it was just right at William Slater Funeral Home, and it was the first Buddhist funeral I think I'd ever been to. And you know, there were things set up on altars and a lot of decorations around, and this big Vietnamese family running around with little kids and older people. And there was a lot of chatter and a lot of activity swirling around the funeral home. And then the widow gets wheeled into the room, and everybody snaps to attention. and then designated people go up to the widow, ask her what she wants. The widow says, I want him to sit down, I want her to stand up, I want these people to move over there, I want to move those oranges off that table, put this picture up there. You know, I mean, she starts like dictating what the place is going to look like, and they snap to it, and everybody kind of takes their place. She is in charge. And that to me just represented so much of the Vietnamese kind of real deep, profound respect for age. And that comes, every peasant culture has that. Every peasant culture, and it's reinforced by Confucianism, which we talked about last time, the dominant social philosophy, especially in northern Vietnam. But the other reason that Vietnamese people have to ask you your age, is because, get this, the Vietnamese language does not have pronouns. Let that sink in. So there's no you, your, yours, yourself. There's no he, him, or his. No she, her, or hers, or herself. No we, ours, or ours. No they, them, or theirs. Can you imagine a language without those words? What do you call people? I mean, it's really odd. And what the Vietnamese people have evolved is a huge number of family names to assign to people. And we have family names. We have brother, sister, mother, father, aunt, uncle, cousin, grandfather, grandmother, and that's about it. Vietnamese have 20 times that number. They have a special word for your father's younger sister who's unmarried. And that's what you call your teacher. So you have Bach, father's older brother. Chu, father's younger brother. Tim, the wife of your father's younger brother. Ko, your father's younger sister. Duong, the husband of your father's sister. Mo, the wife of your mother's brother. The eldest child in North Vietnam, the eldest brother or sister in South Vietnam, the youngest child of the family, the youngest child of your father's younger brother, the child of your mother. I mean, it goes on and on. And all of these special words, have to be attached to a person. So when we first went to Vietnam, our guide was this man, Con, a wonderful man. Back in 2018, our first trip, he was our guide for all three trips, 2018, 2020, 2023. And back in 2018, he was a 35-year-old man. His father was an NVA veteran. And so he had wonderful family stories about the war. He had grown up around Hanoi. And he was just an ideal guide in many senses. He knew a lot. He loved teaching, but more than that, he loved listening. He loved asking us questions about American culture and our understandings of the war. It took about 24 hours for Khan to approach me, and I was the tour leader. And he said this, and this is exactly how it went. I remember it very well. He said this, Mr. Toad, how old are you? And I said, Khan, I know why you're asking. You need to know how old I am because you need to know what to call me. And he said, yes. And I said, well, this is back in 2018, I said, I am, back then I was 52. And he went like this, and this is not exaggeration. I am so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. I said, Khan, no, what's the matter? I said, people have told me that I look younger than my age. Did you assume that I was younger than 52? He said, oh yeah. And I said, does that change what you call me now? He said, oh yeah. I said, what had you been calling me? He said, I had been calling you Big Brother. And I said, what are you going to call me now? And he said, Young Uncle. The second question they ask, and this is also odd, is how many children do you have? It's not, do you have children? Tell me about your children. It's how many children you have. They need to know the number because they need to assign you a status. The more children you have in any peasant society, the more status you have. So if you say you have 13 kids, woo, that's great. You are high up there. You know what I mean? And they ask that question a lot. I've talked about David Lamb before, a friend of mine who was a journalist for UPI. He covered combat in Vietnam in 1968. He also happened to cover the fall of Saigon in 75. And he returned to Vietnam in the year 2000. He was the Hanoi bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times. And he and his wife, Sandy, lived in Vietnam for several years, and they didn't have any children. And David said that, it's just unbelievable. Like, these people ask you very quickly, like, how many children you have. And he had to say, we have 0 children. And they don't change the subject. They say, oh, I'm so sorry. What was the problem? He said that's just a little too personal for him, you know? And so what he learned to do was made up 2 children, and he gave them names, and he gave them personalities. Todd said that they lived in a certain city, and that got them off his back. So large families, extended families are the norm in Vietnam. Again, very much a vestige of the peasant community. Most households in Vietnam are at least 3 generations living together under one roof. It is expected that when your parents retire, you will live with your parents. And that's just how most households are. The other question is a little bit, I think, a little bit more subtle, but you guys will understand it because we talked so much last time about the importance of the village in peasant society. The village is the be-all and end-all of the peasant world. Many peasant societies give their last names, including mine, DePastino, after the villages where they came from. The village is your family, the village is your hard protective shell, the village commands and demands your ultimate loyalty, and it gives everything to you and you give everything back to it. Villages are critically important. So in Vietnam, Vietnamese ask each other, and they also by habit ask Americans, where are you from? And what's interesting is, when they ask you in Vietnam, a Vietnamese person, where are you from? They're not asking you where you live. You could have lived in Saigon for 30 years. They're asking you, what is your father's ancestral village? That's what they're asking you. Because the assumption is that when you die, you will be transported back to that village and you'll be buried there in an elaborate ceremony, and your name literally will be entered into a village scroll, a roll, so that you will be among now that village's ancestors. They need to know where to place you. They need to know how to kind of categorize you. Villages remain incredibly important in Vietnam. And as Alex McClinchy said last time to me, you know, it wasn't just villages. There are villages, and then there are hamlets, and then there are sub-hamlets. It's incredibly kind of a Byzantine social arrangement. And today, there are about 35,000 or 40,000 villages in Vietnam. This is a country of 100 million people, less than 1/3 of the population of the US. And it has about twice as many villages as the US has incorporated municipalities. So villages remain very central to the Vietnamese identity. And so much so that if you don't know, there are a lot of Vietnamese people who don't know their ancestral village. They're orphans. And so they get placed in orphanages. You say the word orphanage in the US, it kind of makes you shudder. I talked to a man yesterday who spent 3.5 years in an orphanage. He's 86 years old. And I said, I dared myself to ask him, can you tell me what that experience was like? And he said this is all he said about it. I learned the art and science of survival. And that's all I needed to hear. And that is the reputation that orphanages had in the United States, and most of them are gone because of that reputation. Vietnam, that's not how it is. In Vietnam, they view orphanages positively. They have positive reputations. And when you enter an orphanage, that becomes your village. So that's where you go back to at Tet. That's where you'll be buried. And you consider the other orphans your brothers and sisters, family members. It's really that profound, this intense devotion to family. So this is all to say that peasant background still means so much. And I would think of all the achievements of Ho Chi Minh, and there were many, and I would say that Ho Chi Minh was a genius, was one of the 20th century's great geniuses. If you define genius as the ability to focus on one thing to the exclusion of everything else for a very long time, that was Ho Chi Minh, who had just dedicated his life to achieving the independence of Vietnam. And he did it through this amazing thing that was seen by most people as impossible, and that is rallying the peasantry, the Vietnamese peasantry, around the idea of Vietnam. Having them lose give up, forfeit some of their loyalty to the village, to embrace this thing called Vietnam. This was a tall order, but he was really the first Vietnamese person to believe it could be done. And he hit upon this idea. He hit upon the belief that Vietnamese peasants were open to indoctrination into nationalism, while Ho was sitting in prison in Hong Kong. Here's a picture of him in Hong Kong in 1930. He was arrested under the name Sung Man Cho. He was living in Hong Kong in a revolutionary underground. And he was arrested by the British. Hong Kong was a British colony because he was subversive, and he was a subversive. He was a revolutionary. But the problem was they held him in prison, and they couldn't find any evidence that he had ever tried to subvert the British Empire. All he was trying to do was subvert the French Empire. And that to the British was okay. And so they held him in prison, and there was a big public debate. It's kind of interesting that this man, Sung Man Cho, actually remains a celebrated court case in Great Britain. Nobody had any idea that he would become Ho Chi Minh. And it took many, many, many decades ever to connect this court case to Ho Chi Minh, but it was Ho Chi Minh. They held him in prison, and they debated, do we extradite him to France, or do we release him? If they had extradited him to France, the French would have executed him absolutely without hesitation. But they didn't. They released him, and that allowed Ho to go on and do what he did, lead the Vietnamese to independence. He's sitting in prison in 1930. And you'll remember from last month what happened in 1930. This massive peasant uprising throughout Vietnam. And I mean, it was massive. About 200 villages, 200 independent revolts around the country rose up, all peasants, against the French, killed a lot of French, seized a lot of weapons, gathered the rice stalks, and then returned to their villages and started farming. You know? It's remembered today. These uprisings are remembered and memorialized in Vietnam today as the Nguyen Tin Soviets. That's what they call them, of 1930 and 1931. It started in February and went all the way through the fall of 1930. And it's remembered as a magnificent failure. It was magnificent because the peasants demonstrated that they were ready to revolt. They had had enough of the oppression they had experienced under the French. It was magnificent also because they demonstrated the raw power of the peasantry. The peasants, who represented 90 to 95% of the population, they had the power to overthrow the landlord class and the French. But they lacked the broader understanding of what they were doing. They overthrew the French, they killed their landlords, and then they started farming. They never once tried to link up with each other. They never once tried to develop a nationwide movement. These were 200 separate revolts, not one revolution, because these were all led by peasants. And peasants don't know. To a peasant, the nation is nothing good. The nation only takes, never gives. The nation might be an emperor who knocks at your village gate and demands your youngest men to serve in their army. The nation is a king who demands taxes. The nation never gives you anything, it only takes. And so they distrust any power outside of the village. Their loyalty begins and ends in the village. And somehow, peasants needed to be indoctrinated, thought Ho, into this broader faith in this idea of nationalism. There was a bunch of Vietnamese nationalists led by this man, Pham Boi Chau, who's remembered today as the first modern Vietnamese nationalist. And you can see he ain't no peasant, you know what I mean? He's as urban a guy as possible, because only urban people are nationalists. Because they have, they live in cities. They understand long-distance trade. They use radios. They ride railroads. They understand, road networks and telegraphs. And they have a broader understanding of the nation. Pham Boi Chau created the first nationalist party to kind of rally Vietnamese nationalists for independence against France. It was a miserable failure. You'll notice the flag of this party, which would later become the flag of the country of South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam. This party was a miserable failure because every member of it lived in a city, which meant they lived in close proximity to French security police, which meant they were always under surveillance, including Fanboy Chow. He was arrested, and he spent the last 15 years of his life under house arrest in Vietnam. And as he was facing his death in 1940, he wrote letters and he wrote a memoir, and he said famously, and I quoted this last time, "My history is entirely a history of failure. But there is no doubt that our nation will achieve independence eventually. Today, there are people more capable than I am. Have you ever heard of Nguyen Ai Quoc?" And here's the man who is talking about Nguyen Ai Quoc. Nguyen Ai Quoc was like a fabled character. He was like, they knew that he didn't live in Vietnam, but they knew that he was the most, he had developed a reputation by 1940 as the most eloquent spokesperson for Vietnamese independence and Vietnamese nationalism in the world. He wrote in underground newspapers, he wrote pamphlets and had them distributed. He wrote under the name Nguyen Ai Quoc, which means Nguyen the Patriot. And he, just through the force of his writings and almost through the force of his legend, I mean, he was like Robin Hood, you know what I mean? He couldn't have really existed. He kind of existed in people's minds. But he did really exist. Nguyen Ai Quoc was not his real name. He would eventually return to Vietnam in 1941, Nguyen Ai Quoc would, and he would change his name for the final time to Ho Chi Minh. And he became the leader of the Vietnamese movement. Who Ho Chi Minh was is a real mystery. He's one of the most intriguing and fascinating people of the 20th century because he's so well known, and yet actually we know very little about him. He was a master of disguise. He wore disguises a lot. He changed his name over 100 times during the 30 years he was living outside of Vietnam. He lived in well over a dozen countries. We don't know exactly all he went. For many, many years, until maybe 20 years ago, we didn't know his birth name. We do now know, thanks to a wonderful professor at Penn State University, and who wrote a great, William Duker, who wrote a great biography of Ho Chi Minh, as well as the terrific work of some Vietnamese scholars who have really investigated his past. We do now know that Ho Chi Minh was born under the name Nguyen Sinh Cung, and he was born in a little village right on the border of Nguyen and Ha Tinh. And Nguyen and Ha Tinh were the two provinces that had the most revolutionary activity in 1930. So he was born in a village right there. They've recreated the house in which he was born. You can tour it today. We also know that his father was this man, Nguyen Sinh Sac. And Nguyen Sinh Sac Ho Chi Minh was not a peasant. He could never have been a peasant. There's no way a peasant could ever have led this movement. And Ho Chi Minh was no peasant. His father was a scholar, a Mandarin in the French colonial bureaucracy. He was a bureaucrat. He was a man of large vision. He was also famously a really brilliant man. But what made him a little different was that he was an orphan as a child. So he was taken in, Nguyen Sinh Sac was, taken in by a family, and he was put to work. And he's a 6-year-old child, riding a buffalo in the rice paddies. And he would hop off the buffalo, run to the school, which didn't have any windows. You could imagine a simple thatched schoolroom. And he was not allowed in the school, but he would listen outside the window for the lessons. And he would write his answers in the dirt with his finger. And the teacher would come out with a broom and smack him to get him away, to run away. And he did that 4 or 5 times, and the kid kept coming back. And so the teacher said at one point, "Well, kid, if you're going to keep coming back, you might as well take a seat in the classroom." Nguyen Sinh Sac immediately showed himself to be the best student in the class. The teacher ended up adopting him and raising him to be the equivalent of a PhD scholar. And that's what he did. Nguyen Sinh Sac would later go on to have a family, and Ho Chi Minh would be one of his children. We don't know that much about Ho Chi Minh's childhood. We're pretty sure that Ho Chi Minh was really, really highly educated in some of the best French schools that Vietnam had to offer. And he took a special interest in the French Revolution. learned how to revolt. He learned how to lead an uprising. He was in one of these schools, probably, we're not, again, not certain that this is the same person, but we do know that somebody by his name was in this elite French school in Hue in 1908. That would have put Ho at 18 years old. And this kid was expelled from the school for leading a peasant uprising. That made him a fugitive from the law, and he changed his name, we do know this, to Van Bach, and he hopped on this very ship, this very one in this picture, and I forget the name of the ship, but he hopped on that ship in Saigon in 1911, and he left Vietnam, and he did not return for 30 years. Where did he go? He hopped on the ship and worked as not a cabin boy, he was a kitchen assistant, like a kitchen aide. He worked in the kitchen, the galley of the ship. Where he went exactly, we're not sure, but we do know that he went to South America, he went to North America, he went to Europe, he was in a lot of China and Asia, and a little bit of the Middle East and Africa. He told different stories to different people. He loved to tell the story about the time he lived in Harlem. We're not sure he ever did, but he told that story. He said that he went to Marcus Garvey, if you know Marcus Garvey, the great black nationalist leader. He went to Marcus Garvey speeches and lectures there. He did also claim, and the Parker House Hotel in Boston claims, that he worked as a pastry chef, as a sous chef at the Omni Parker House. If you go today, this is in Boston, the Omni Parker House near Boston Common. If you go today, you'll see this plaque. 1912, 1913, future Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh works at the Parker House Bake Shop. We do know that he went to London. He claimed to have studied personally under Escoffier, the great French chef, as a pastry chef. He claimed to have worked, and there's some evidence that he did, at the Carlton Hotel, at the Ritz Hotel in London. We do know that by 1919, he is in Paris. He may have gone somewhere between 1916 and 1919 during World War I. He moved to Paris, and this is the first picture we have of him, right here. He is standing up here in a French Socialist Party meeting. He was a member of the French Socialist Party. And as a member of the French Socialist Party, he really pushed hard for the party to get behind Vietnamese independence. You know, Vietnam, Indochina was a French colony, and he wanted the party to get behind the French, releasing Vietnam and granting Vietnam some home rule under the French. And he found that the French socialists, they talked all great things about socialism in France, but they had no interest at all in Indochina, and they had no interest at all in the colonials like himself. So he's under the name Nguyen Ai Quoc. Ho Chi Minh founded a newspaper called La Pariah, which is the pariah, which is a newspaper in France for all those people from the colonial diasporas, all those people from French colonies in Africa and from Asia who were now living in Paris. They would read about what was happening in their worlds in this newspaper. Nguyen Ai Quoc became a very celebrated, this is one of his cartoons, became a celebrated cartoonist and an essayist, kind of denouncing, you can see the French abuses against colonial peoples. Here's a Frenchman, riding two colonials. This is a rickshaw driver pulling a guy. He became well known. This is what made Nguyen Ai Quoc well known in Vietnam, his agitation, constant agitation for Vietnamese independence. After World War I, you'll remember in 1919, there was a big conference at Versailles, where the Treaty of Versailles was passed. This is the Versailles Conference, June 28th, 1919. Ho Chi Minh was there.
Wow.
Ho Chi Minh delivered a petition requesting that the conferees recognize Vietnamese independence. He had a petition sent to this guy, President Woodrow Wilson, and this guy, French President Georges Clemenceau. These two guys ignored the petition, as you can imagine. Ho Chi Minh had some good reason to think that the Allies would recognize Vietnamese independence because, after all, Woodrow Wilson made a very big deal at the end of World War I that World War I had been fought in part for self-determination. That means every nation gets to be free and independent of empires. Woodrow Wilson never spelled out that what he really meant was that European nations got to be free of empires. He didn't consider Asian or African nations to be part of this new celebrated freedom. And Ho Chi Minh was trying to push the Allies to recognize Asian countries' independence like Vietnam. This was a really frustrating time for Nguyen Ai Quoc. He was searching for allies, European allies, to fight alongside of him to help promote Vietnamese independence, and he found nothing. Even among left-wing socialists, nothing. And then, in 1920, Ho Chi Minh read this pamphlet. It was by Vladimir Lenin, Lenin on the National and Colonial Questions. Lenin, who was the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 and 1920, wrote this very brief, dense, turgid pamphlet. And he was the first one, like the first European, to say wars of national liberation in what we would call the Third World are really an important part of the global struggle that will lead toward a glorious communist future. He connects, in other words, communism with nationalism, national liberation. He says this, and this is a cartoon of Lenin sweeping out the monarchies from the southern half of the globe, The weak and colonial nationalities have suffered centuries of enslavement at the hands of the great imperialist powers. That was a sentence that grabbed Ho Chi Minh's attention. And then he goes on to say, Lenin does, we need to support the peasant movement in the backward countries against the landowners and every remnant of feudalism. This pamphlet electrified Nguyen Ai Quoc. And I mean, he immediately quit the Socialist Party and joined the French Communist Party, which had just been created. In fact, he was a founding member of the French Communist Party. By the end of 1920, Nguyen Ai Quoc disappears. He goes to Moscow to get an education. He goes to China to help with Chinese communists. He circulates in this really dangerous, lethal, and complicated revolutionary underground. He runs afoul. This is a world where, oh man, if you say the wrong sentence at the wrong time to the wrong person, And he did that a few times. He ended up in a few Soviet jails. He was in the Alps for a while under Stalin. And it was largely whenever Ho Chi Minh fell against or out of his communist brethren, it was usually because they knew that he was really a nationalist, which you were not allowed to be. You're supposed to be a communist first. You believe in communism first. It's not your nation that's your loyalty. They suspected that he was more loyal to Vietnam than he was to communist ideology. Ho Chi Minh, and I just want to emphasize this, because I think this is such an important part of his public persona, and an important part of his story. Ho Chi Minh, today and then, always presented himself to the Vietnamese people as a kind of kindly, weak, peasant, simple man, Uncle Ho. He was never one, and this is true, he was never one for any kind of ostentation. He lived in a thatched, simple house his whole life. He made it a point to wear threadbare tunics, threadbare shirts. He wore what were known as Ho Chi Minh sandals. And those of you who are Vietnam veterans might remember Ho Chi Minh sandals. These sandals are made out of tires. Yeah, used tires. And he made it he was very, made it a point to wear kind of sandals made from used rubber tires, just to kind of show what a simple man he was. He's usually depicted kind of with children, again, the kind Uncle Ho. We don't know if he was ever married. We think he probably was. We don't know if he ever had children. We think he probably did. But there's so much that's a mystery about him. But he was always kind of depicted as a celibate, committed father of his nation, father of all Vietnamese people. Often depicted laughing, joking, playing with children. Here he is with children. Here he is kind of being goofy in a cave. But this was really a way that masked his true personality, which was very sophisticated. He was, again, somebody who survived in this really dangerous, sophisticated revolutionary underground. And he did it through cunning and skill. And he did it by changing his name, slipping across borders, changing his look. You know, there are a lot of photos that until very recently, like this one, could not be published in Vietnam because people would not accept that this would be Uncle Ho, you know, in a derby hat and a cigarette like this. But this was Uncle Ho, you know, a kind of a scholarly, nerdy, revolutionary young man. And this is what he looked like, again, when he was in prison in Hong Kong in 1930. And it was in Hong Kong in 1930 when the uprisings happened. You'll remember the 200 revolts. That Ho Chi Minh, it's like he decided there in prison that Vietnamese independence might come in his lifetime. He had never thought before that it would. He thought that he would just push it along, die, and then other future generations would keep on pushing. But he came to believe that it was somehow possible, that it would somehow be possible to rally the peasants around Vietnamese nationalism through the vehicle of communism, of shared property ownership. You can imagine how that would appeal to peasants, right? We talk so much how in a peasant world, there's no real sense of private property. There's a great sense of communal property. And so the ideology of communism was just a good fit. But Ho also knew that if the peasants tried to rise up too early or at the wrong time, they would get wiped out. And that's because peasants are weak and the French are strong. You know, the French have all the weapons, they have all the firepower. You have to wait until your enemy, the French, are weakened, and then you strike. And by just an amazing coincidence, in 1940, the French got weakened. And you know how. The French got weakened by the invasion of Nazi Germany into France in the spring of 1940. Adolf Hitler, and this is a famous picture of a Frenchman crying. He's actually crying in Marseille. It's usually assumed that this man is Parisian, and it's June 14th, 1940, when Paris fell. But the photo was actually taken in Marseille in September when Marseille fell. But it's still good, because it represents just the sorrow and the agony of the French defeat in 1940. You remember what happened. Adolf Hitler launched a blitzkrieg war through the Low Countries, the Netherlands, neutral Belgium, and then in Luxembourg, and then into France itself. And it was a stunning and amazingly quick victory. Just defeated the French within 6 weeks. On June 23rd, France has capitulated, and Adolf Hitler himself visited Paris, the one and only time. He only spent 1 day there. And he said, I thought it would be a lot nicer than it is. And he went back home and he never returned. This was the moment that Ho Chi Minh knew he had to strike. Because now France, which controls French Indochina, is prostrate. France is defeated. France is weak. And the weakness was apparent to everyone, including Germany's ally, Japan, in Asia. Before France even capitulated, Japan contacted the French leaders in Indochina and said, hey, we're going to come round. And when we come round, we could either do this the hard way or the easy way. You could fight us and we'll kill you, or you could hand over the keys to the colony and we'll let you run it, but we'll be the power behind your administrative authority. And that's what the French decided to do. The French collaborated with the Japanese and allowed the Japanese to occupy first Tonkin, the area in the north part of Vietnam, and then second, Cochinchina or Saigon in the southern part of Vietnam. The Japanese at first wanted to occupy North Vietnam because they wanted to control the supply lines to China. They wanted to cut supply lines that were supplying Chinese nationalists in China. But then they realized, of course, that Vietnam has all these natural resources that they could exploit, and so then they moved in and took over the entire country. And at first, many Vietnamese people, I would say, kind of celebrated Japan's takeover of Indochina. I mean, after all, they couldn't be any worse than the French, right? You know, this is a great piece of Japanese propaganda where you have a Japanese person, a Vietnamese person, and a French person, kid, girl, kind of singing and playing together. But the reality, it did not take long for the Vietnamese to be disabused of the illusion that the Japanese were somehow going to be friendlier toward the Vietnamese than the French were. In fact, they were worse. And the Vietnamese would often call the Japanese the dragon that just squeezed every little bit of wealth and rice from Vietnam. They took everything that the French didn't even dare to take. Because the Japanese, they had one thing and one thing only in mind, and it was to rake off all the useful resources that can be used in building the Japanese war machine. You know, the coal from Hongdae, the rubber from South Vietnam, and the rice to feed the Japanese Imperial Army. There was more rice grown in Vietnam under Japanese rule than there ever had been under French rule. But less rice was eaten in Vietnam. The Japanese took it all. And the Japanese kind of confiscation of Vietnamese rice to feed the Japanese Imperial Army led to the worst famine in Vietnamese history that is still very well remembered today. In this famine, 2 million people, 10% of the nation's population, died in 1 year. Just horrific. And this is very typical of Ho Chi Minh. He sees the disaster. He sees the disaster unfolding in Europe. He sees the disaster unfolding in Asia. He sees the disaster befalling his country. And Ho Chi Minh focused on that one thing, Vietnamese independence, doesn't see it as a disaster. He sees it as opportunity. And so in early 1941, he makes the fateful decision, after 30 years, to walk across the Chinese border and enter Vietnam for the first time. Here he is. This is a depiction of Nguyen Ai Quoc. He would return, change his name for the final time to Ho Chi Minh, which means he who brings light, and he would begin his struggle for Vietnamese independence. He lived in a really rugged country up here in the northern part of Vietnam. I've never been there. It's some of the most forbidding terrain on earth. Very few people have ever been there. Tiny, tiny villages filled with what Vietnam veterans would call montagnards, mountain people. Tiny, tiny, but very sparsely populated. But it was here that Ho Chi Minh kind of landed and lived. And this is where he lived, in this cave. You could go see it. It's a cave in the Pak Po. You could go visit it, and you could read that sign, which is Pak Po Cave. President Ho Chi Minh lived and worked here from February 8, 1941 until the end of March 1941. And even that isn't really accurate because he did live there then, but he would also return there because he soon became a wanted man. You know, the French were after him, the Japanese were after him, rival Vietnamese nationalist groups were after him. And so he rarely stayed in one place too long, and he would return to the cave over and again between 1941 and 1945. And it was there in the cave that he met for the first time 2 of his compatriots that would go down in history with him. One, Pham Van Dong, who would later become the premier of Vietnam after Ho Chi Minh's death. The other, the famous Vo Nguyen Giap, the great military general, the considered a military leader. Ho had never met them. They all met each other, and that's where they founded their movement to bring independence to Vietnam. And this is an unprepossessing group of people. I mean, look at Ho on the right and Jap on the left. I mean, they look young, they look small, they look weak, they look unhealthy, and Ho Chi Minh was very unhealthy his whole life. But it's them who founded this organization that they call the Vietnam Doc Lap Dong Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam, shortened as the Viet Minh. And those are important words. League for the Independence of Vietnam. You don't see the word communist there. You don't see the word revolution there. They downplayed their communism. When they were trying to get nationalist allies, they were trying to reach those who were in the cities, bourgeois, middle class people who had no use for communism. So they downplayed their communism. But when they went into the villages, they talked about the glorious communist future that awaited them when the Viet Minh were victorious. This was a remarkable movement because they were full of zeal, but they had no weapons, and they had no money, and they had very few people, maybe 50 to 100 strong followers. And so what they did is they would do a few things here and there, maybe plant a mine that the Japanese might run over, that might impede their war effort in Japan. But they spent most of their time trying to steal rice and deliver it to the villages, to feed the hungry villagers. They spent time plowing fields for the villagers, stealing medicine from the Japanese to deliver to villagers. What they really did was spread propaganda for years, anti-Japanese propaganda and pro-Viet Minh propaganda. And they were doing all this because Ho had this big strategic vision that was entirely improbable. This is early 1941. Ho was guessing, planning, that somehow, and this is what the Japanese Empire looks in 1941, what it looks like. Ho was guessing that sometime soon, for some reason, the United States was going to get involved in the war. And that was going to turn the tide of the war in Asia. And that the United States would recognize the Viet Minh as an ally, an anti-Japanese ally, and that the United States would then recognize Vietnamese independence at the end of the war. That was the idea. This is before Pearl Harbor. So when Pearl Harbor happens, Ho Chi Minh says, yes, exactly as I planned it. Because now the United States is entering. But not only did he predicted that this would happen, he also predicted that something even more unlikely was going to happen in Europe. He predicted this, that somehow two countries that hated each other, the United States and the Soviet Union, would put aside their differences and become allies and together wage war against Germany. And that at the end of the war, these two allies, and of course Ho Chi Minh was a close associate of the Soviet Union, and the United States would then both support Vietnamese independence from the French. That was the idea. That was the dream that motivated the Viet Minh through the war. But the Viet Minh, they lived in places like this. They lived in this, remote village the entire war. And it was here that they made their first contacts with Americans. The American OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the forerunner of the CIA, had heard about this group of fanatics in Vietnam who were fighting the Japanese. And so the OSS, through indirect sources, made contact with the Viet Minh and just sent a message that, hey, if you run across any American flyers, pilots who have bailed out over North Vietnam, tell us where they are, save them if you can, and we'll connect with you. And they did. Ho Chi Minh started supplying information on Japanese troop movements in Vietnam and rescued a couple pilots who had bailed out over North Vietnam. And then on July 16th, I think it was July 16th, 1945, oh, and by the way, I love this picture here. This is, again, Uncle Ho's headquarters during the war, and here are students, members of the Young Pioneers, coming to get a lecture on Uncle Ho's heroic work during the war to achieve Vietnamese independence. On July 16, 1945, the OSS drops 7 secret agents into North Vietnam, 7 Americans. And their job is to equip the Viet Minh, find the Viet Minh, give them some weapons, train them a little bit, and then go on an operation with them against the Japanese. Can you imagine how insane that was? I mean, come on. But these 7 intrepid Americans, sure enough, they bail out of an airplane in the jungles of northern Vietnam. The Viet Minh find them, cut them out of the trees, because this is triple canopy jungle, you know? So there's no way they're making it to the ground. They have to be rescued by the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh take them to meet Uncle Ho in that little thatched hut, and this is the first picture they take together. There's Uncle Ho. Here are the Americans of the Deer Mission, they were called. And the Deer Mission would spend weeks, 6 weeks, training these guys, you know, living with these 50 or 100 cadre of the Viet Minh. They were giving them weapons, showing them how to march, showing them how to throw grenades, showing them how to, you know, fire a rifle, showing how to infiltrate and detonate and exfiltrate and all that kind of, you know, guerrilla warfare kind of stuff. And they actually did attack a pretty remote Japanese base camp and wiped out the Japanese in it. And it was this great moment. Like, it was early August when they did this. And it was a great moment. They all went out and got drunk together, and it was like this great big celebration. And then, of course, the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki helped bring an end to the war, suddenly. And on August 14th, 1945, the Japanese surrender. And Uncle Ho makes a decision. Now is the time to declare independence. And he puts a message out that the Viet Minh is now going to take over the country. He had no idea how many followers the Viet Minh actually had. But he said he gave the people 2 weeks. Meet in Hanoi. If you can make it, if you could walk to Hanoi, get there. For September 2nd, I'm going to make an important announcement. And in Hanoi on September 2nd, 500,000 people assembled. It turns out the Viet Minh had won enormous prestige through the war years, for the work that they were doing mainly in helping the villagers. Uncle Ho made sure to have his most bare of his threadbare shirts on and his Ho Chi Minh sandals, and he walked up to this podium and he tapped the microphone and he said, "My fellow countrymen, can you hear me?" And the whole city just roared, "Yes, I can hear you." And then he started to deliver his Declaration of Independence. This is still very much celebrated in Vietnam today. September 2nd is Vietnamese Independence Day, and the spot where Ho Chi Minh delivered the speech is right here, which is now his mausoleum. Ho Chi Minh had one request: don't build me a mausoleum. Don't lay me out like a Lenin, you know, frozen in wax. I want to be cremated, and I want my ashes spread in every province in Vietnam. So of course the Communist Party ignored his wishes, laid him in wax, and put him in this mausoleum. He would absolutely have hated that. But it's right there where he delivered the Declaration of Independence, and this is what he said. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States in 1776. You think he's trying to flatter Americans? In a broader sense, this means all peoples on earth are equal from birth. All peoples have a right to live and be happy and free. These are undeniable truths. Nevertheless, for more than 80 years, the French imperialists, abusing the standard of liberty, equality, and fraternity, have violated our fatherland and oppressed our fellow citizens. They have acted contrary to the ideals of humanity and justice. For these reasons, we, members of the provisional government representing the whole Vietnamese people, declare that from now on we break off all relations of a colonial character with France. We are convinced that the allied nations, which at Tehran and San Francisco have acknowledged the principles of self-determination and equality of nations, will not refuse to acknowledge the independence of Vietnam. A people who have courageously opposed French domination for more than 80 years, a people who have fought side by side with the Allies against the fascists during these last years, such a people must be free and independent. For these reasons, we, members of the Provisional Government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, solemnly declare to the world that Vietnam has the right to be a free and independent country, and in fact, is so already. The entire Vietnamese people are determined to mobilize all their physical and mental strength to sacrifice their lives and property in order to safeguard their independence and liberty. Ho Chi Minh then went on to found his first government, cabinet, and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was born. But Ho Chi Minh would soon learn that it's one thing to declare independence, it's another thing to keep it. And powerful forces were at work in the north, central, and southern part of Vietnam to undermine Vietnamese independence and overthrow Ho Chi Minh. And that's where we'll pick up the story next time. I'll see you then.